Greetings everyone, welcome to the 2018 AGM. This is actually my fourth AGM as CEO, having taken over in 2015, so it's a real pleasure to see quite a few faces that I've seen here over the last 4 years coming back again, so it's great to see that support. So in terms of the running, I'll go through the presentation. I think more than happy to have questions at the end of that. And then we'll do the formal part of the business with the various resolutions. And then I've got a bit of a slideshow, just to really, 2018 in pictures, is just to really give people who obviously don't get the opportunity to go out to the mine sites, a little bit of an overview of our sites, our equipment and our people. So I'd like to sort of finish off with that. So through the presentation, we'll run through our results for FY18, where we are up to in 19, how our business has changed, an overview of the operations, a brief look at strategy, and then really, more importantly, as part of the strategy, where we're going for the future. What's our next 5 years look like? An update on the LMCH case, and then a view of the forecast for the remainder of FY19. And as Togo said, I mean, FY18 has been a transformational year for us. As I said, unfortunately, we had one last time injury. I'll cover that in a bit more detail. We had 1.5 million tonnes of equity sales, record profit of over 70 million, record EBITDA over 90 million. We have taken the first step towards a joint venture in Canada, and obviously we've increased our asset base quite significantly. As Togo said, health, safety and environmental compliance and management is a very important part of the business. I mean, our goal here is not to have these as add-ins to our business. This is how we do business. So a good systematic way of operating is also an efficient way of operating and leads to the lowest cost production. If you're hurting people or if you're damaging the environment, you end up in courts, you end up in lost time, and you end up expending money on things that don't actually lead to any improvement. So we had that one last time injury on the Huntley West closure project. There was a dogman involved in some craneage bringing down a gantry. A piece of the gantry material came off and struck him. It could have been a lot more serious than it was. He lost a bit of time. Key learnings was contract management, and as part of that was exclusion zones around when you're doing these high-risk activities. I think the critical thing on the safety front, though, was the hundreds of hours of risk assessment and then evaluation of those risk assessments, putting the right controls in place, and then monitoring, training and then monitoring the effectiveness of those controls across the whole business. And you can imagine taking over 3 new sites this year. That's been a huge task, and everyone in my management team and in the teams at the mines have done a great job of actually starting that process. And I say starting because it never finishes. We're in a continual loop now of improvement, and this is just now the norm. As we change something, or as we get to a set period in some cases, we'll continue to review those assessments on the sites, and we'll continue then to retest them. In the health part, this has been we've had no health-related lost time or reported injuries, but there's an important part of our business in terms of making sure that our activities aren't affecting the health of our employees or the people in our community. So we spend a lot of time measuring dust, noise. Machine vibration is actually a new one on the New Zealand front. It's probably not so new across Australia and the Americas. And also we're spending a lot of time now with our employees around personal health, and that goes from the board all the way through to the mine workers. So I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along. We had one serious water discharge at our Canterbury mine during FY18, which resulted in a prosecution from Environment Canterbury. The water discharge was serious in itself. It was dirty water being discharged into an environment that was full of dirty water because it was a really high rainfall area time. But the critical thing was that our controls that we had said were going to be in place under the resource consent weren't in place in a timely fashion. And that's really the thing that's has led to the prosecution. I mean, the learning from that obviously is that we need to make sure that we've got these things in place prior to starting production. We had a number of overlapping priorities, and unfortunately we dropped the ball on that one. But again, we've done hundreds of hours of risk assessment across all of our sites, and in particular we've been concentrating on our rehabilitation and closure planning, because you can expend a lot of money later in life of a mine if you don't get the planning right as you're moving into new areas. So that's been a major issue that we've identified, and we are putting measures in place to combat it. So just looking at our contribution to our local areas, I mean, we did a survey on the West Coast, and it was probably unusual to find it, but about 91% of our people actually live quite close to a mining operation, so our employees are heavily involved in the communities that we are part of. We put about 220 million into local suppliers, about 40 million goes directly to government through royalties and other taxes, and about 40 million at the present time is going into employee benefits, salaries in other words. So how are we going so far this year? No lost time injuries, no serious medically treated injuries. We've generated about 28 million cash so far. We've got about 47 million in the bank, and we're on target to be somewhere north of 90 million for our EBITDA. So we've had export sales of over 330,000 kilotons at an average price received of about 230 New Zealand dollars per tonne. So as Tuku said, our business has changed quite significantly. In 2017, we produced 400,000 tonnes, totally in the domestic market, totally into the South Island domestic market, and a very cyclic business where during the wintertime when the cows dried off or the crops aren't being produced into export food manufacturing, we had a real low period in cash flow, and then obviously made hay while the sunshine in the summer months. That's changed around last year with 1.5 million tonnes of production and sales at a equity level, and that'll go to about 1.6 in the FY19. The same with EBITDA. Obviously, we've seen a significant rise in EBITDA, and we're seeing that continuing through into FY19, and obviously on the back of good sales revenue and also good cost control. We've seen a significant lift in our number of employees. So obviously we had 95 in FY17, rising up to over 400 in last year. The big jump this year is actually, and it looks like, well, we're going to have a whole heap of extra cost, but that's actually in FY19 we've now taken over the mining contractor has been replaced by owner-operator at Rotowaro. So those employees have all come across under our books. So they'll actually be cheaper because we don't have a contractor margin on top of the cost of those employees. Obviously, in terms of net assets, it's quite a significant lift, to 70 odd million in FY18. Just with the run rate that we're now operating at in terms of that production, going from 400,000 to 1.5, our working capital's increased by over 30 million. Our gearing's reduced. We've only got about 7.9 million of the US bonds sitting in straight debt on the balance sheet, and some finance leases for equipment, both over last year's and new. And we've really maintained it at the end of June 2018, we had pretty much the same amount of cash that we started with. So quite a significant uplift in the various stats across the business. So looking where our operations are, Maramarua, south of Auckland, a little bit further south is Rotowaro. They have two ex-Solid Energy mines owned through the BT mining joint venture. Major customers, New Zealand Steel, Genesis and Fonterra, plus a lot of other similar customers to the South Island. So producers using coal as a thermal input to add value to primary production for export. South Island, obviously Stockton, export mine, Buller project is adjacent to that. Canterbury produces about 200,000 tonnes just west of Christchurch, and Takitimu about 200,000 tonnes just north of Invercargill. Timaru office is our major distribution point for the coals produced in the South Island, and obviously we've got a regional office in Christchurch and a head office in Wellington. I think that one of the biggest changes is, if you have a look at where our revenues are now coming from, nearly 3/4 of our revenue is from steel making, so a combination of export out of Stockton and the 500,000 tonnes going to New Zealand Steel out of Rotowaro. The remainder is made up of dairy and food manufacturing, and then Genesis is around about 7% of our revenue at the present time, and obviously that varies depending on the climatic conditions in New Zealand and the electricity market. And then really looking at our split between Export about 1 million tonnes. This is FY19 numbers for this year. That's actually 1.1. 800,000 out of the Rotowara Maramarua complex and 400,000 out of our domestic operations. So looking at each of the mining areas in a bit more detail, obviously Stockton 65% owned by Bathurst through the Bathurst Tallies joint venture. Looking at this here, we are going to go up by another 10% in production from last year to 1.1 million tonnes of sales. The price delivered or the cost delivered to the boat is coming down a little bit. We were anticipating that being a little bit lower, but we're moving about 1.5 million BCM more than the original plan had set in Stockton this year. That's a combination of really taking advantage of the pricing at the moment to put some of that into cost and some of it on the balance sheet. And just as importantly, we're bringing forward some of the BCM that's going to be required in about 3 years' time, so that'll spread that out. So what we're aiming to do now is obviously maintain or increase our margin slightly this year, but more so insulate us from any drop in the coal price in future years. We're still very much indemnified from the immediate rehabilitation costs. We're going to do about 20 odd hectares this year at Stockton. That'll be fully paid for out of the escrow. And obviously we've also still got the 100% indemnity from costs relating to acid mine drainage treatment. We are doing a lot of work, and I've got a couple of slides later on around resource to reserve conversion within the Stockton complex. But at the present time, we've got about 10 years worth of reserve sitting in front of us, and that's marketable reserve. We've discussed it before, but the significant suite of infrastructure that we purchased as part of the Stockton mine is in good condition and is working well. The wash plant again was built in 2010 and it cost about 120 million Kiwi. The aerial's a little bit older, built in 1954, but has done over 2.2 million tonnes in the 12-month period. So we're not overly taxing it at 1.1. It's a low cost, actually low maintenance piece of plant. We've got a lower load out and we've got scalable contracts with port and rail. And obviously we've also got a suite of existing customers and business development opportunities that are meeting the needs of the mine. So in terms of our customer spread, or our product spread, we've moved more, as we did depict last year, to the semi-hard range. I mean, that is our cheapest and highest margin coals that we produce on the Stockton Plateau. So we've got about 15% of hard coking coal that mainly goes in the Japanese market. Semi-hard makes up about 65% of our overall sales mix. That mainly goes into India and now into Australia, plus some BD work into Hyundai or into Korea. And then we've got a mop-up product which is actually less significant now than it was before, at around 20% of a high-ash coking coal. The main thing there is it's got quite a high sulphur spec, so it allows us to move some of that coal that doesn't really fit into these other two markets. So just looking at the main drivers with the international, the export coking coal market, obviously China's still a major player. So what we're seeing is that there's been a tightening on the supply side. There has been no growth at all, really, particularly out of Australia. There's been some quite large projects that are on the books that are either not going forward or have been stalled. Some of the other seaborne traders coming out of the States is actually quite high cost and relies on quite high pricing to actually mobilise that supply. And we are seeing, though, there is strong steel demand and probably an unusual circumstance across this business, in that the steel makers are making money, the coke makers are making money, and the coal producers are making money. So there is an equilibrium that does appear to be holding quite well. We've had quite steady pricing over the last 12 months in particular. There has been quite large movements, so environmentally in China. So there's been some closing of about 260 million tonnes of steel making capacity in inland China, and then preference is being given to the seaborne or eastern seaborne blast furnaces. So obviously they've got closer access to ports and to international coal imports. And there's also a flight to quality. So, we are seeing quite a significant shift, as we're seeing in iron ore as well, where customers are going for a higher value or a higher value add product. So we see, and I think the market's generally seeing, that there's going to be a relatively flat supply demand curve across the next couple of 3 years. There's no major projects that are coming on and any that are coming on are really only placing existing capacity that's going out. So for us, obviously we've got a niche coal. I mean, we're a small producer in the overall market, but you know, if you look at our ash range, we're really unique in terms of across the world, having nearly all of our coal going out at less than 5% ash content. You know, if you compare that to Australia, where they're up over sort of the 5 to 10, and in fact now sort of creeping up towards the 15 in the hard coking coal space. So that's always been a major attribute of the New Zealand coals, is that low ash content. It's a very low phosphorus content as well, and it's a high reactivity coal because it's just about all vitrinite. So what that allows is for this to be actually a blend improver across a lot of different coals, and that's what we're seeing. I was lucky enough to visit the Sakado plant of Mitsubishi Chemical in Japan earlier this year. You know, they're blending 8 coals into basically each truckload of coal going into their coke ovens. And our part of that blend is very small, but it's an important part because of that reactivity. Also seeing in India, you know, the Indian domestic coals are very high ash, and we are seeing now our coals being blended with domestic coal to allow them to increase their coke production. So it's very much our marketing strategy is around, you know, increasing this value in use. So showing the advantage to these customers by the use of these New Zealand coals, and how they can then actually go out and buy cheaper coals in the market to actually make their coke requirements. You know, and we have got some sort of negative perceptions. I mean, the sulphur content is higher than a lot of the Aussie coals, but you know, the things like the lower sulphur content, in particular the lower phosphorus, helps to offset some of those that maintains us in the benchmark position. So North Island domestic business, again, the Rotowara Maramarua mine, 65% owned through the Tully's Bathurst joint venture. We'll produce about 800,000 tonnes out of this complex this year and make a margin of about $32 per tonne, and that includes paying all of the BT overheads. So that's not significant, but it is an important part when we're looking at this EBITDA margin. We've now got a full complement of people under our mine ownership as part of now that we've taken over as the mine operator. We've increased the reserve base at Rotowara with the Waipuna West project, which we'll talk about in a minute, and we've got a good reserve base at Maramarua. So the key customers here really are, for Maramarua is Fonterra. There are some movements in that business, and then we've also got Tully's through Open Country Dairy and through some of their other abattoir companies. New Zealand Steel and Genesis are the 2 largest customers. So the Waipuna extension is a high strip ratio block that's actually the natural southern extension of the Rotowara block. So this is Rotowara, our active area now, and this depicts the Waipuna West extension. So about 1.6 million tonnes of reserve. It gives us about another 4 years worth of operating in the area. And the critical part of this was we needed really to partner with our 2 major customers to get this block away. As I said, it is high strip ratio. The critical thing we went to them with was we had to maintain our margins. Otherwise, you know, we would just mine out the remaining coal within this block and then move on to other areas. There is another development project in the area, but it's probably 3 to 4 years away. So we were looking for this as being a bridge to the future for them and for us. So by doing this deal, by purchasing the equipment, we've now maintained the largest plant in New Zealand in the area, and it's going to be actively productive for us. More importantly, we're competing all the time for the workforce. So there's roading projects, there's a lot of other developments going on in that sort of Golden Triangle area that is competing for skilled labour. So by maintaining the labour, maintaining the equipment, and also the presence in the area, it allows us to then to bridge into these other projects if they prove to be viable. And we've got good customer support in doing that. So our existing 100% owned South Island business, 400,000 tonnes we've produced and sold across these 2 mines. They're very complementary in terms of coal quality. We actually intermix them quite regularly across our customer base. Customers, again, large dairy operators and large food manufacturers. We're really moving away from the household coal. We used to do bag coal out of Timaru, for instance. In fact, we used to do 35,000 bags a year out of the Timaru yard. We don't do that anymore. So that part of the business is moved away, and we've moved now into value add to primary production. So around about 10 million EBITDA we generated out of this business, and that includes covering all of the BRL Bathurst corporate overhead. The domestic business, North Island, as already explained, the Waipuna West is actually kicked off, and that allows us another 4 years supplying to our existing customer base. That's tied up now. We're basically fully sold out of that complex over the next 4 years, and then allows expansion to other areas. The market is still strong. I mean, Genesis announced, I think, 3 years ago that the plant was going to be shutting in 2018. That got extended to 2027. It is now being extended to 2030. So there's no guarantees in that, but we do believe that those customers are going to be there. Fonterra's had the same sort of indications. In the South Island, it's very much the same thing. The South Island business relies on coal for its cheapest, easily transported, storable energy source. There's no reticulated gas, and electricity at the moment, if it's available, is about 6 times the cost per megajoule of using coal. So again, we're not going to go out and buy a new 20-year resource or go out and really drill to get a 20-year reserve. What we're going to do is we'll continue to convert resource into reserve over the next 5 years, and or if customers like Fonterra want to take it into another longer term contract. So that's really what I've been talking about. It has been since 2015 encapsulated in our strategy. So every year we review this, and we'll do the same again in February this year. I mean, the critical thing for us was, underpinning it is really zero harm. I mean, if we, as I said right at the start, if we're hurting people, if we're damaging the environment, if we're not looking after the communities we operate in, then we're going to lose our license to operate. So that nearly goes without saying. That's not so much an integral part of our business, that is our business. So in terms of our operations, we went in from 2015, if you remember, and turned the strategy on its head from being an aspirational coking coal producer to being a domestic producer that was making money. We achieved that in the first couple of years. Yes, it was a small profit. I remember, Russell and I going to Singapore when we first were trying to do the roadshow for the raisings. We made $1 million. That really gave the indication to those shareholders who backed us into that deal that we could do it, that we could actually manage the mines that we were operating in. They were small, but they could produce enough cash to actually cover our overhead. So that's continued on. I mean, our cheapest producer now is Takitimu, closely followed by Canterbury, and we're doing the same thing with our North Island operations and our Stockton operation. And we'll do it through, improving our equipment utilisation and improving our mine planning and improving our productivity, not by asking people to work harder or for less money. Because, we want to maintain a slow employee turnover. Believe it or not, it's hard to get good operators, and it's even harder to get good technical people. We're having to still continue to import those people. So we need to be able to be a good employer and be seen as a good employer to be able to maintain that employee base. And then our critical sort of strategic item was to maintain our New Zealand domestic base, and at that time that was really South Island centric. We've done that. We've actually increased it slightly, but we really are on the maximum. We're about 55% market share of the South Island business now, and we are really not seeing any major growth here. There might be another dairy expansion, but we are also seeing some of the smaller customers drop out, particularly as the ETS is starting to bite some of those parts of the business. So we firmly believe we can maintain that, and we've got the mine life and we've got the cost right to be able to make money out of it longer term. We set out to grow our New Zealand exports by 50%, and as you'll see from the growth profile, I think we can achieve that with our existing projects, and then more importantly with diversifying into additional metallurgical coal supply. So trying to put that into a pipeline. Obviously Waipuna West now is in the development phase, and we'll have production commencing on that in about FY20. The New Brighton project is an extension of Takitimu, so over the next couple of years we'll continue with some drilling and some development work on that. And again, we'll expend money on that if the customer base looks to be there to be able to support it. And then with our existing operations, there's really a continuous improvement going forward in converting resource to reserve on an as-needed basis. We'll come back to Crown Mountain, but that's the Canadian asset that we're just starting the evaluation of now. Buller project, again, long-standing project within Bathurst, the original thing that brought Bathurst into New Zealand. Still very much alive. We're still doing work on it today. and we've still got a plan to bring that on stream in about 2 to 3 years' time. And then there's some other resources within the Stockton complex that again we're doing some work on this year and have done some drilling and some evaluation work, and then they'll continue to be converted into reserve as we move forward. So what that looks like in terms of production profile for the next 10 years, obviously from where we came from, 400,000 tonnes. The yellow depicts our domestic base, so that's the combination of our South Island and our food sort of centric business in the North Island as well. New Zealand steel, the steel making in grey, and our exports out of Stockton in blue. So the jump up here in 22 is anticipation of coal coming from the Denison Plateau onto Stockton Plateau and into the market mix at about 350,000 tonnes initially, and then stepping up to 650 with the base being maintained at around about 1 to 1.1 out of Stockton. That goes forward about another 5 years past this graph, and then we see the Stockton tonnes starting to drop off, and then the Denison tonnes continue on for about another 15 years past that point. As I said, the Buller project, you've probably seen this slide before, but I mean the critical thing is now, we've got a development cost of around 25 versus around 200 million to actually bring that project forward. So what we're doing recently is we've actually got a rig working right here now in the on the edge of the escarpment West Forey tier block, doing some large diameter holes. We'll utilise the output of that to then test that coal against the washability of the Stockton washery and come up with some real numbers. Now that's probably the last critical point leading towards us signing off on a feasibility study for that whole area. In the meantime, we're doing some of the spring-summer environmental studies, and we've also just done a small program of drilling in the upper Waimang area in Marshalls North, Marshalls and Beggs, and also in Deep Creek. So again, there's that'll add to the resource base information. The models will be updated, and then we'll start doing some mine planning and further resource work around that. So we're at this phase at the moment. We're working towards a feasibility study early in CY19, early next year. That'll then allow us to come up with the final footprints, which will then lead to applications for consenting. And I think just looking at again, that one of the critical aspects of this whole thing is this wriggly red line, which depicts the haul road connecting the Denison Plateau with the Stockton infrastructure, which allows us then to mix it in with Stockton coal and export it via the Knocklewall rail loadout. And the red line is the rail system that then takes it across to Littleton. So we've got coal that's well understood going through a washery and an export infrastructure system that again is fully owned by Bathurst through the BT joint venture, into scalable contracts for rail and port, and into existing customers who are eager and keen for this coal. Once we get through the consenting process, we know that's not going to be simple. We know it's not going to be easy. We are going to be opposed. It took us 2.5 years to get the escarpment project up, so that's the timeline that we're allowing for this phase. So that's why we're saying it's going to be FY22 before we'll see coal starting to flow out of Sullivan, and then that'll flow through at increasing rates up to about 650,000 tonnes after a 3-year period, and then that then carries on for about another 20 years past that point. So just looking at those organic growth projects within Stockton, again, that's the same haul road depicting coming down through and going to Stockton. So obviously, not only this is the existing Cypress mine, not only does it allow the Denison assets to come through into the system, but it also allows us to pick up these blocks of coal as well and transport them through and exist into the same infrastructure. Deep Creek's a little bit different. This is the Mount Frederick southern extension of Stockton. It's fully mined out and been about 99% rehabilitated, but the main haul road has been left intact. Obviously it gives access to the point for reed control and other measures, but also allows us access down through quite a short haul road to actually access the Deep Creek assets. So Deep Creek is very similar to the remaining sort of west line coal resource on Stockton, high Romex, low ash and reasonable sulphur. The stuff in the Waimang Valley is very similar to Cypress. It's a semi-soft but very low ash, reasonable sulphur again. So in later years we'll see a natural blend of these two blocks of coal, around 900,000 tonnes per annum on a potential reserve base of around about 9 million tonnes. So Ruawarra, so our existing mine operations at Rotowara are operating in here. We're about 1 year worth of coal, 18 months worth of coal in that area. Waipuna West is the southern extensions we've looked at. So the distance from there to our existing rail loadout and stockpiling facilities is about 4.7 kilometres, and there's another block about 4.7 kilometres as a crow flies to a block called Ruawarra. So we picked this up as part of the purchase, so it's not a new block. There has been some drilling, and we've actually just completed some drilling ourselves. The project's at pre-feasibility level. We haven't got a JORC compliant resource yet, but that's coming quite quickly. So the intention over the remainder of FY19 is to complete the pre-feas study and get that out there. We've got some negotiations with local landholders, and also the mineral rights for this area is a combination of private and Crown minerals holdings. So we've got some negotiations around that as well. That will all then feed into a feasibility study, which we're looking to get commencing in the middle of FY20. So the goal here is to have a consented project by the end of FY21, and then start stripping during 22 as we get this capacity starting to drop off out of the Waipuna West and Rotowara area, with then coal coming in to replace the supply coming out of Rotowara, Waipuna West in FY23. Indicatively, we're looking at around about a reserve base of about 8 million tonnes, and once we get those figures, then we'll publish them. So, Canadian project. I think when we were sort of looking at this as part of our strategy to try and diversify our geographic base, but also look for further sources of metallurgical coal that we can put into the international market. Obviously, we looked at New Zealand first. We haven't really been able to identify, it's well known the resources remaining in New Zealand. So obviously, you've already seen we've identified the major assets that we can sweat in New Zealand. There's some assets around Greymouth, but they're smaller and they don't really fit into the product mix, apart from, say, as sulphur trimmers in some small cases. And there's already good third-party producers that are in those areas, and we already buy a little bit of coal off them to trim some of the sulphur, for instance, in some of our boats. So we see that as being an important part of their diversification as well. So we went looking in Australia and into Canada. There was a range of projects that Russell in particular looked at. And the thing that stood out with the Jameson one was that it was a greenfields project that had been well managed. It was probably of a scale that was below the eyesight of any of the majors. It was in a well-known coke and coal producing province in the Elk Valley. Teck are dominant in the area. And there's existing infrastructure that could be readily utilised by this project. The project had been well run by Jameson, but they were also starved for cash. So to take the project forward, they need funding. So it's very much toe in the water stuff for us. So our first tranche of investment has been in the exploration program of 4 million Canadian. That's basically been expended now. We've done the project, that program during the Canadian summer that ended in October. There is work continuing on with the evaluation of the samples that were taken, and then obviously that's feeding into further evaluation work of the project, leading towards a feasibility study. Our next tranche, which again we've actually commenced, is around a maximum of 7.5 Canadian, and that gets us up to 20% of the project once we've expended that full 11.5 million. And that money is going into permitting, environmental studies, and works towards things like water balances and the selenium solutions, mitigation solutions, which will then all lead into feeding into the feasibility study. And then we've got a clear decision point here, which is 100% at our discretion as to whether we step further forward with the project. If we decide to, then for 110 million, we end up with 50% of the project, which will then be in a operating form. And that's anticipated to have coal coming out, which I didn't talk about when we're back here, coal coming out in FY22, building up to around 1.7 million tonnes on a 100% basis after a 3-year period. So that's the green part of this growth, which gets us at a management level up up to around over 4.5 million tonnes, or at an equity level over 3.2 million tonnes of total sales. So the exploration program, two main thrusts here. One was around the coal quality in what we call the southern block. The northern block was clearly hard coking coal and relatively high CSR. Good in the ash range, good in sort of phosphorus and other impurities. But the southern block could be between PCI and semi-hard. And obviously, if it's the semi-hard range, then the project really stacks up. If it's in PCI, then we need to do some further evaluation work. So at the moment, we're just starting to see those results coming through. There's nothing in that doesn't give us confidence in the project. The drilling program went well. There was no environmental issues as part of that drilling program. So there was also some environmental studies going on during that point in time. Plus, we also then did some geotech work and some geochemical sampling through strip sampling plus some boreholes, some core samples. And that leads into obviously geotech into the mine designs and spore pile designs, and in geochemical mainly into the selenium and potentially acid mine drainage controls. All those then feed into the bankable feasibility study. Groundwater wells were also installed as part of that program, which again allows us to build up water balance modelling and also enhance our mine design. So the phases going forward now, there's some particularly important milestones in around the jurisdiction. So we need an application for an environmental assessment certificate that's actively underway. There's some statutory timeframes around the delivery of that and also the signing off on that. Obviously, with the selenium mitigation, it's one of the key risks to the project, in that the area has got some quite strict limits on the amount of selenium that can be put into the Elk River system. And obviously, this project can't add to that base. I mean, basically the system is at full capacity now. So the progress that's being made by Jamison in this mitigation strategy looks very good. The phase 1 work, the laboratory work, has come out favourably. That is now being backed up by larger scale laboratory work. And then the information out of that will then lead to spore pile design, and then with some of the geotechnical work as well and geochemical, which will then go into the application for the environmental assessment. So again, we continued on with the environmental baseline studies, the coring, standard coring for the geotech and for overburden testing. We did some test work, pit work, leading for a better understanding of the geotechnical and overburden characteristics. And really the whole thing then is leading to two main streams. Getting the mine permit application in place and approved, and obviously signing off on it that it's a feasible project. And then really once we get the results now, particularly from this large core stuff, we're doing some coke testing as part of that as well. We'll then sit down with the Jamison team and our team, particularly with Sam's technical people, and start working up the coal marketing strategy for the project. So one of the critical things for us is that we've had a lot of involvement in this, even though we're only at the present time about 10% of the project. In terms of input into the exploration program, the outputs from the actual program, and where they'll lead in terms of marketing, we've had a lot of see-through in the project, and I think that's going to give us a lot of payback as we move further into the feasibility. So I suppose we've got to talk about some negatives. It can't all be rosy. Those who all know, the Buller project was purchased off L&M in 2010. That's what brought Bathurst into New Zealand. The original deal was for 40 million once the feasibility study at that time had been signed off. That's been paid. There was a further 40 million US payment due when the first 25,000 tonnes had been shipped from the permitted areas, and then there was another 1 million tonnes due, another 40 million due when 1 million tonnes had been shipped from the project area. The dispute at the present time all comes down to whether the 25,000 tonnes have been shipped and or whether there is clauses within the contract that, if they're read to the letter of the English language, give us the ability to defer the payment of the contingent payment, the performance payment, as long as royalties continue to be paid at the higher rate. So L&M took us to court. Obviously, we all know that. had a negative finding back in 20th of August 2018. We've appealed that finding. We believe there's a number of grounds for appeal. We've indicated that the appeal will be heard sometime in the March quarter next year. Our legal team is very confident. We've actually had a number of peer reviews done of both the evidence suite, the findings, and also our defence. And really in response to that, because with the data coming out, we had anticipated paying a dividend, but we decided that it was prudent at that point in time to warehouse the cash within the business. So that's obviously still there, as you can see from our cash balance. And we'll review that as we go forward, as we build further cash. The worst case is we're going to pay L&M Coal Holdings $40 million, but obviously we do see that there's further rights for appeal, even if we do happen to lose it on this appeal, but I don't think we're going to. So let's look at the metrics for this financial year. I think we already announced back in the start of the financial year that we anticipated we were going to make about 75 million EBITDA at 100% at Bathurst level. We've upped that in the quarterly last to 92, and that's really based on the continuation of the high prices within the export business. So yeah, 1.1 million tonnes of sales out of Stockton, cash costs are around 97, means a margin of around $90, leading to an EBITDA at the 100% level of around 100. Similar metrics across the North Island and South Island business, which then leads us to a midpoint of EBITDA of about 92. So that Stockton business is based around a coal price of about 176, and obviously we get 80% of that at a 68 cent dollar. So the dollar's still slightly lower than that, and obviously the coal price is quite significantly higher than that, being 218 this morning, and we are anticipating that's going to carry through. So at the moment we're anticipating doing about 24 million EBITDA for Q2. We're probably slightly in front of that run rate at the present time, and then reasonably consistent about 20 million for quarter 3 and quarter 4. And obviously if this pricing continues through, then we should see higher lifts than that. There's no real red flags on the horizon in terms of our shipping. I mean, we're pretty much fully sold in terms of contracted coal going forward, and the same with our North Island, South Island business. So I'd like to thank our competent people who have diligently signed off on their resource and their reserves.